22nd African Union Heads of State Summit is set to kick off tomorrow for 2 days. Today, the Executive Council wound up their deliberations. They will be presenting that before the heads of state and government tomorrow for more deliberations. Well, today as well, the NEPAD had a meeting here under the auspices of looking at the infrastructural situation in Africa, according to the theme of the African Union, which is agriculture and food security. But Ferdinand, it is actually the peace and security situation on the continent that is the theme here, really, that is on the agenda, topping the agenda of the African Union Summit here. At the moment, the Peace and Security Council is holding a meeting where they are discussing the situation in the Central African Republic, inside South Sudan, in Mali, Libya, and Egypt, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, the Central African Republic is causing continental concern. The UN Security Council recently approved some 500 troops from the European Union, of course, to go into Central African Republic. That is together with the 5,000 African Union troops that are already there, and they will be joining the 1,600 French troops already in the Central African Union, in the Central African Republic, I beg your pardon. But already the United Nations says that inside the Central African Republic, to contain the unrest in that country, at least 10,000 troops would be needed. Well, let's get more now on that developing situation in the Central African Republic and also in the troubled spots in Africa that are topping the agenda here at the African Union Summit. I'm now joined by Dr. Paul Simon Hardy, a senior analyst there with the Institute for Security Studies. Thank you very much for joining us here now.
My pleasure.
The United Nations say they need more troops there for the Central African Republic there. What is your analysis of the African Union's response?
The African Union has really tried to get involved in the Central African Republic, first by relying on the regional body, the Economic Community of Central African States. But when it was clear that that ECAS was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis in the Central African Republic, so that's when the regional peacekeeping or peace stabilization mission there was turned into an African Union mission. But the African Union mission is supposed to have 6,000 troops, but now they are barely 5,000. And even with addition of the French troops, they haven't been able to stabilize Bangui, let alone the rest of the country. So that's why certainly another development is much needed today.
The African Union has about 5,000 troops on the ground instead of the 6,000 there. Does the African Union have the capacity to contain the situation inside the C.A.R.?
Alone, certainly not. I mean, that's just the reality. The African countries don't have the capacity. They are already deployed in so many other crises in Africa. So the capacity is overstretched, and there is certainly the difficulty they have actually to meet the 6,000 mark is an indication of that. But even with these 6,000, I don't think that much will be reached on the ground. So we need more troops, but also more equipment, more logistics.
All right, the African Union Summit here, the theme this time is agriculture and food security, but it is conflict situations that are topping the agenda here with a lot of sideline meetings there. The Peace and Security Council is currently meeting at this moment at the African Union. What is topping their agenda?
On the agenda, actually, the major crisis of the moment, the Central African Republic. South Sudan, President Salva Kiir has been invited actually to make a presentation in front of the head of state. So it really promises to be quite a controversial meeting because these developments have also given way to certain responses that might also be controversial. And of course also Egypt will be one of the items discussed by head of state.
All right. Well, we understand, though, that Egypt wants to be reintegrated into the African Union. What's the sentiment on that?
The African Union is pretty much divided over this issue. It's really a case of following the norms that all African countries have agreed on, and also making special treatment to a country, be it a big country like Egypt. What happened in Egypt after the removal of President Morsi was considered by the African Union as a coup d'etat. The Egyptian government, the current transitional government in Egypt, considers it as a revolution, actually. The AU has a completely different view, and as a consequence has suspended Egypt, which didn't go very well in Egypt. So Egypt is lobbying quite substantially to be reintegrated into the African Union. But there are lots of countries that support Egypt, but as many that are actually against its reintegration, at least before the end of the transition that will be marked by the next elections in that country.
All right, Dr. Paul Simon, we'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you for your insights on the conflict situation in Africa. While Libya is also part of the agenda there at the Peace and Security Council, and it's been 2 years now since Libya's transition. That transition still fairly in trouble as a result of the armed militias that are roaming the country.